welcome to the Psych webinar. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be joined today by George Goldsmith, CEO of UK-based Compass Pathways. Compass is currently investigating psilocybin therapy for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression, which affects a very vulnerable patient population. George, it's a pleasure and a privilege to have you on today's webinar. Could you quickly give us a quick introduction to Compass and some of its origin stories from last year?
Absolutely, and thanks so much for having me today. Compass started arising from a personal situation in our family where one of our family members, our son, really struggled with mental health issues. We tried to get help, and like so many people, despite being prescribed multiple medicines, etc., he was not helped. And as we dug into this more and more, we found that his situation was actually far too common, where traditional medicines may not actually help enough patients. And this leads to a condition called treatment resistance. So when we encountered this, we really felt that there was a need perhaps to look at alternative approaches, ways to actually bring new models of care to patients. And we came across psilocybin back in 2013 as a potential idea based on prior research. We became really interested in that. And we created a mental health care company. Compass Pathways is a mental health care company, critically important. We're not a psychedelic company, but we are a mental health care company using psychedelic therapy as our first initiative to really transform mental health care at scale. We're very focused on patients, and this is everything we do is really about how do we get a new model of care to patients as quickly as possible, and to make sure it's accessible, which means it has to be reimbursable, which means it's about evidence of cost effectiveness, evidence of comparative effectiveness, and evidence of safety and effectiveness. So we're very, very much focused on developing the evidence required to provide access to this important new innovation.
Fantastic. And speaking of evidence, Compass Pathways recently released data from its COMP360 psilocybin trials looking into treatment-resistant depression. What did the results show, and what was the importance for the industry?
Well, I think that answering your second question first, I think the importance of this is that there have been so many really small studies and different indications, but they've only been signals. So we've never done the scale work that's required to bring a medicine to patients. That's a completely different model than the traditional small academic studies, which generate papers, which are critically important to advance a field, but they're not sufficient to reach patients. So what we had to do is to really look at how do we develop large-scale studies. And our study was by far the largest ever conducted, 10 countries, 22 sites, 7 languages we trained therapists in. And so one of the things that's really remarkable about this was the simple scale and the scope of what we were doing. And that trial basically looked at a single dose of psilocybin to determine which dose is most effective, 1, 10, or 25, and which is the best tolerable or most safe. And so we were comparing those 3 doses. The one was almost like a placebo. It was a control that we used. And this was always coupled with preparation, so psychological support provided by a therapist prior to, during, and following. And that was the package that we were looking at with 3 different doses. And so this study actually demonstrated that without a doubt, the 25 milligram was most effective and the safest combination of safety and efficacy. We saw a very significant result at day 2 and then week 1, and that maintained to week 3, where we had a statistical significance of less than 0.001. So this couldn't have happened by chance, where the 25 milligram resulted in a significant decline in depression. Now, the last thing I would mention is that we're working with a very seriously ill depression population. These are patients who've been struggling often for years. They've had 2 to 4 failures of prior medication attempts that just haven't worked for them. It's kind of why we started the company, right? It's for people who aren't served by the current approaches. So this is a very, very ill group of patients who cost a tremendous amount to health systems in addition to the huge personal cost to them and their lives and with their families. So we're very focused on these very difficult to treat populations. And what we saw was 25% of those patients at 12 weeks after a single dose of psilocybin coupled with therapy, the psychological support we provide, yielded remission in about a quarter of the patients. Now that is huge for a very well-controlled population and has never been seen before, this notion of such a large change after a single dose. So we'll look at a whole host of how do we bring this forward with the evidence we need to treat the most number of people and to really care for them and improve their lives.
It sounds like psilocybin therapy has enormous potential for patients with treatment-resistant depression. What timelines is Compass Pathways looking at to regulatory approval and being able to provide psilocybin therapy to patients with treatment-resistant depression?
Well, let me take a tiny detour. So it does have promise for the 25%, but remember that 75% didn't have that same benefit at 12 weeks. So one of the really important things that we have to do to bring this forward is to understand who responds. How do they respond? Can we identify them up front? So this is a really critical piece of research because there's a lot of breathless enthusiasm that this should be placed in the water supply. It works for everyone. Well, it doesn't. It's another approach that could be very helpful to some people. We have to understand who. Given that caveat, we're doing the research. We expect that this would be receiving regulatory evaluation late 24, 25, and be available to patients shortly thereafter. However, it's really important to remember that the information we need is provided to payers and health systems so they have the information to be able to reimburse this, because that's the real key. The people who need this most are suffering. They don't have ready access to lots of funds typically. So we really need to make sure this is part of the health system. And we're doing that research as well, how to fit it in and how to make sure we have comparative information.
Fantastic. And that brings me brilliantly on to my next question. How does Compass Pathways see psilocybin therapy being integrated into healthcare systems globally? And how will it be achieved at scale to reach as many patients as possible?
It's a huge question. We're still, everyone in the field is, I think, working hard on that. So what we're doing right now is working with those health systems to understand what models they have that could be most akin to this. Now, there's something that's been developed over the last few years using ketamine, both racemic ketamine through infusions or a product developed by Johnson & Johnson called S-ketamine, which also requires supervision during the administration. Obviously, the work that MAPS, the great work that MAPS has been doing on MDMA and PTSD also has a similar model. So we believe that, and there's another device called transmagnetic stimulation, which also requires the supervised administration. So there's a whole new class of approaches to help people who are suffering from mental health issues. And that requires supervision and kind of specialty clinics. So we see this fitting into that emerging specialty clinic model. And there are almost 2,000 of those just in the US alone. And in the UK, where we're based, we're working closely with the NHS, looking at how this can be integrated into specialty care clinics, research clinic infrastructure. And this is part of a new initiative that's being formed here in the UK by the Office of Life Sciences called the Mental Health Initiative and Mission, and really looking at how do we bring innovation to patients faster. And we're part of that. There will be other companies, obviously, with different approaches that will be part of that as well.
Fantastic. And moving from treatment-resistant depression to PTSD, Compass Pathways started a study last year looking at PTSD and acquired some IP. Can you speak to some of those compounds and the pipeline goals?
Sure. So a couple of things were blended in there. Let me take them separately. So we did announce that we are now sponsoring a program, and that'll be both in the UK and in the US, focused on post-traumatic stress disorder. Again, this is another area where patients are suffering greatly, and there simply aren't enough tools. So we're looking to see how psilocybin might be able to help this group of patients. And we're doing that through initiating our own phase 2 studies. And that was just announced. The studies have not yet commenced, but they are in final stages of being ready to launch. So that's on PTSD. Now, we're also looking at a number of other indications through our research partners that we have, ranging from anorexia to body dysmorphic disorder, starting something even in autism. So there will be researchers that we work closely with to identify new areas of high unmet need. So this is really our focus, not to focus on where needs are met, but to be focused on where needs need to be met and simply aren't being met sufficiently today. So that's what we're doing with our Comp 360 specialized. What we've done is develop that as a medicine, which requires a great deal of care and rigor. So we're developing psilocybin as a medicinal product. And so that's what we're doing in that area, multiple indications. Now, you asked about new things. We're without a doubt the largest developer of new psychoactive substances. We're doing that in conjunction with two laboratories, one in the University of Sciences led by Jason Wallach, working with Hamilton Morris closely, building out a team there, looking at next generation and beyond psychedelic medicines. We're also doing it in our Basel laboratory with Mikal. And so these areas are developing new compounds. And what we're looking for are there ways to optimize. There's a great deal of breathless enthusiasm right now on short acting. Unfortunately, the enthusiasm, like so much of this area, is way out ahead of the data. But we do need to develop data to see, is it the length of the experience, or is it just the fact that one has the experience that determines the clinical benefit? So we are looking at shorter acting substances, but again, the data are out. The evidence doesn't exist yet that those will be as effective. So we have to do the hard work. And I think that's really what Compass is about. It's really moving from promise to reality by doing the hard work that is respected by governments as they approve medicines to improve public health.
Excellent. And Compass Pathways has been making innovations and strides in this field for quite some time. But the industry's really expanded in the last couple of years. We've seen an extra $2 billion worth of investment pumped into public listed companies. At the forefront of the industry, who does Compass Pathways see as its competitors in the space?
Well, again, it's part of who the space is. So we see, companies like Sage, who are very much focused on developing innovative treatments, Axsome, Karuna, Johnson & Johnson. So these are companies that are serious about transforming mental health care. In the psychedelic area, we don't view them as competitors. We're all trying to make a difference in patients' lives. But obviously, MAPS has made great strides. Atai is working on some very early stage things. They were created out of their investment in us. And so I think they saw promise, and they're looking at other areas of promise. But I think the problem is so large here. What we're really looking at is who are the companies that can really bring the rigor, the science, and the resources to bear to do this. This is a very resource intense job to get the evidence to the level you need. And keep in mind, and I'll stop here, when we just look at Europe and UK and North America, US and Canada, we're talking about almost 900 million people. And we know a great number of people suffer. And to be able to make this accessible as a medicine, as a new model of therapy and care to that many people, some of whom suffer deeply, this is really the largest scale kind of effort that we can possibly do, where we have evidence and can really help the people in need across that huge swath of the transatlantic population. And obviously we're looking beyond that, but right now that's where we're focused.
George, can you speak to the patient population and what Compass is doing to protect these patients with personalized treatments?
That's a really great question, Russ. I think that we have to keep in mind that these patients have been suffering tremendously over large portions of their life quite often. Patients who suffer with treatment-resistant depression, by definition, are not helped by existing medications or therapies. And these patients have, in many ways, given up hope. And so one of the things that happens when some new model like psilocybin therapy is provided is their hopes become quite high. And I think we have a responsibility to manage that appropriately, because we know that psilocybin therapy is not a miracle cure. It could be quite helpful for many patients, and quite a number of them benefit in a way that's never been seen before. But also some patients don't respond. And we have to acknowledge both sides of that as responsible stewards of this area. And I think what we've seen with our patients coming into the study is quite often they say, we're here for the psilocybin cure. Now imagine they come in and they don't receive, for example, the highest dose, which we know could have been more effective. So we have a responsibility to make sure that people's expectations are that this may help them or it may not. And we have to be very genuine about that. Our goal, as an organization, is to learn who does respond and how to have more people respond. And that's why we're doing the science that we're doing. It's why we're assessing each therapy session and understanding the preparation of psychological support, what happens in the session, what happens afterwards, and looking at how that correlates with outcomes. So when we do this work of psilocybin therapy, COMP360 psilocybin therapy in our case, we have a responsibility to understand who will benefit and who may not benefit, and how to make sure there are more of the former and fewer of the latter. And we're doing that by the application of technology, machine learning, looking at what exactly happens in a therapy. How do people's narratives shift? And is the narrative shift predictive of outcomes? All of this research is ongoing right now as we speak, and it's really groundbreaking. I would probably end by just saying to this question that what we saw was a huge transformation in the late 80s, early 90s in cancer care, where suddenly new technologies were present, a deeper understanding of the mechanisms of cancer, and those things came together to move into a whole new era. Prior to that, what we had is often, poisons, very toxic substances that we pointed to a particular tumor, but they also had profound side effects in other parts of people's bodies. We're now moving beyond that kind of blunt instrument. And what we're trying to do in psychiatry, and certainly with COMP360 psilocybin therapies development, what we're trying to do is to understand the science of who responds and how to actually make that number larger, but not to convince people that somehow it's 100%, and if they've failed, it's their fault. This is something that we have to really be responsible for when we have vulnerable patients at our care.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me today, George, and for the insights that you shared on Compass Pathways, the industry, and what the company's got coming up in its future. It's a very exciting time, not only for Compass Pathways, but the industry and patients in underserved treatment diseases. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.